My son keeps talking to the audience. My son, Cade, is smart. He's only 6 years old, halfway through the first grade, and he's already begun reading books that even I struggle to get through. He's a sharp kid, but he has some quirks. And listen, all kids have quirks. One thing I've learned as a relatively new father is that kids are weird. They talk to the walls, eat bugs, see things in the reflection that aren't there. You get the gist. Kids really do the darndest things. But recently, my son has reached a new level of oddity, one that is out of my jurisdiction as the oblivious goofball dad who still makes hot dogs for every meal. I became a single parent after my wife passed a few years back. It's been impossibly difficult. I won't sugarcoat it. Being the sole caretaker of Cade has been the single hardest thing I've ever had to do next to attending my wife's funeral. Cade, though he was only 4 at the time, took his mother's passing hard. He would ask for her constantly, throwing wild fits, thrashing around like a fish out of water. At any minor inconvenience, he would beg for his mother. I didn't know how to handle it. He'd often throw tantrums in public, wailing like a banshee in Home Depot as passersby would stare with judgment spilling out of their wide eyes. I felt utterly helpless. All I could do was attempt to calm him in a hushed tone, promising that Daddy was there to help him. But Daddy was not enough. Every child needs their mother. I remember wishing I had the funds to take Cade to see a child psychologist or at least a licensed medical professional. I work in construction and barely make enough to pay each month's rent, let alone provide health care for my poor son. Looking back now, I should have downsized so I could afford it. Cade's explosive fits continued until about a few months ago. These tantrums would occur every other day, if not daily. Then suddenly they dwindled to once a week. Then after another month, none at all. I was relieved, to say the least. It was a weight off my chest to avoid the pointed glares from strangers on the street as I'd haul a hysterical Cade into the car, practicing the patience I didn't know I had until fatherhood. But once Cade's meltdown ceased, a new issue presented itself, one that scared me far more than any tantrum I've seen him throw: imaginary friends. I know what you're thinking. Every kid has imaginary friends. And you're right. But Cade's imaginary friends were a little bit different. He called them the audience. It began one night during dinner when I had the bright idea to saute some spinach alongside boiling the usual hot dogs in hopes Cade would get his greens in somehow. I scooped a heap onto his plate and placed it in front of him, beckoning him to try. "It's good," I said, feigning a smile. "Popeye eats it to get big and strong." Cade looked at the plate quizzically, looked at me, and looked back at the plate. He sat there for a while, staring the spinach down as if we're the innards of an alien creature. He looked at me again as if I might be crazy, then pushed the plate away. "No, thank you." "Cade," I said warningly, my dad voice making an appearance, "you have to at least try it." Cade made a humming noise as if pondering this deeply and began to stroke his chin. "I'm not sure," he had said finally. "Let me ask the audience." Cade turned to face a window next to the kitchen table. The window faced our backyard. Though dusk had long since departed, the outside world was dark as doom. My son, staring out into a window of nothingness, appeared as if he were simply looking at his reflection. The lights in the kitchen and the contrasting darkness outside created a mirror-esque effect. What do you think? There was deafening silence for a moment. I arched an eyebrow, waiting for the imaginary response from this mysterious audience. It was the first time I'd heard him mention them. I figured it was his new, foolproof method of avoiding any vegetable consumption that evening. After a moment too long, Cade turned back around to face me. They said no. I scoffed and gestured to his plate once more. "I'm sure they did. Now go on, have a bite." "No, I can't, I'm not allowed," he said again. "Cade, knock it off. Please eat your spinach." "No, Daddy, they said no." I had assumed he would whine like he usually did when he didn't get his way, but this time his tone sounded different. Desperation clung to his voice as if he were begging me to understand. I dropped it. I was too tired to fight him. He went to bed with a belly full of hot dogs unaccompanied by sautéed spinach. Unfortunately, the audience wasn't as easy to get rid of as a plate of boiled hot dogs. The following week, Cade's imaginary friends made an appearance once again. I was trying to get Cade in his pajamas for bedtime. The usual routine went: pajamas, teeth brushing, bedtime story, lights out. always the same order. But tonight was different. Cade decided to brush his teeth before changing into his pajamas. "What about PJs, buddy?" I asked him, curious about his change in routine. He had been doing this bedtime routine the same way since before my wife passed. I imagined the routine was comforting to him, reminding him of when my wife was still around, which is why it was so odd that he had decided to switch things up suddenly. "The audience told me to do it this way now," he replied with a mouthful of toothpaste froth. There they were, again, the audience. A sudden curiosity crept into my mind. "Why?" Cade glanced at his open bedroom window quickly. "I don't know. They just did." A sudden chill ran down my spine. I hadn't remembered those curtains being opened. Curtains are always closed before a bedtime routine. I walked to the window and pulled them shut. After story time, when it was time for lights out, Cade refused to let me touch the light switch. "Dad, the audience wants the lights on." Cade cupped his tiny hands over the switch against his bedroom wall, creating a makeshift barrier, refusing to budge. I rolled my eyes. "Nice try, Cade, but the audience doesn't get to decide the rules." Fear flashed on Cade's face as he snapped his head to look at me, wide-eyed. "Don't say that, Daddy." His calm tone was eerie, and I took a step backward. "Cade, please, you can't stay up all night just because the audience told you to." "Yes, I can," Cade responded, his voice low. He was staring at the window, curtains closed and all. At this point, I was thoroughly unnerved, if I'm being honest. Something in my gut was telling me these imaginary friends were not very friendly. Not just an excuse to get out of vegetable eating, but an excuse for Cade to be up to no good. Even still, I had paternal duties to attend to. "Well, tell the audience to say goodnight." I scooped Cade into my arms despite his pleas and tiny fists of rage. I placed him gently on his bed and made my way towards his bedroom door, flicking the light switch off, signaling he had no choice in the matter. The lights in Cade's room remained on. I stopped in my tracks, spinning around, trying the switch once, twice, 3 times again. The lights didn't turn off. The switch must have been broken somehow, I thought. Despite my rational explanation for the phenomenon, the panic that began to bubble in my chest did not subside. "You're sleeping with me tonight." The next morning, the light switch started working again, and I was able to exhale the breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. But that feeling of relief didn't last long, as the week that followed was filled with even more peculiar coincidences. I say peculiar, but I think a more suited adjective would be horrifying. On Friday, Cade said, "The audience doesn't want him to go to school. I get a flat tire on my way to drop him off." On Monday, Cade says the audience doesn't like Jacob because he hogs the soccer ball during recess. On Tuesday, Jacob falls and breaks his arm. He'd be out of school for 2 weeks. On Thursday, Cade says the audience doesn't like Mr. Teddy, Cade's favorite stuffed animal, anymore. Mr. Teddy is found slashed open from the belly up, fluffy guts spilling from his abdomen. I began having trouble deciphering whether this was Cade's new method of acting out or if there was really some ominous force at play. I could have rationed each occurrence away by blaming Cade, but I knew in my soul that Cade wasn't that kind of kid. He was sensitive and bright. He was no teddy bear killer. The audience began to infiltrate my thoughts more than I would have liked it to. It was all Cade talked about, and more often than not, the audience would lead Cade down the path of destruction. Everything came to a head this past Saturday night while I used the bathroom, leaving Cade unattended in the living room watching an episode of his show. As I was washing my hands, I heard a loud crash, followed by a glass shattering. I ran to the living room and found Cade, looking guilty as ever, standing next to a wedding picture of my wife and me, glass scattered across the hardwood floor, smashed to bits. My instinctual response was to make sure he wasn't hurt, which, thank God, he wasn't. But afterward, an inexplicable anger coursed through me. "Cade, why would you do something like that?" "It wasn't me. It was them. The Audi—" "Go to your room," I shouted, and Cade scurried up the stairs in tears. After a few minutes of feeling consumed with guilt, I started towards his room to apologize. I stood in front of the doorway for a moment, preparing myself for a long apology when I heard Cade's voice. He was talking to himself in his room. Well, he was speaking to someone, but I heard no response. "But I don't want to do that," I heard him murmur. "I love my daddy." I walked into Cade's room the second I heard him referring to me, and he looked spooked, like I had caught him with his hand in the cookie jar. He was positioned by the window, kneeling, facing the blackness of the night beyond. I could have sworn I saw something moving by the window, a figure cloaked by the lightless sky. "Cade," I said slowly, "who are you talking to in here?" Cade didn't respond. Instead, he got to his feet, arms hanging by his sides, and dramatically flopped onto his bed, face pressed into the mattress. This was Cade talk for "get the hell out of my room." Though I was still fixated on the window, exposed by the open curtains, I snapped out of my trance to focus on my priorities. "Cade," I say softly, "Daddy is very sorry for yelling." Cade let out a but kept his face against the mattress, refusing to look at me. "Is there something you want to talk about? Maybe a reason why you're feeling sad?" I tried to coax it out of him, but he wouldn't budge. "It wasn't me," he had said, his voice muffled by the bedding. "It was them." "You didn't break that picture of Mommy and I?" "No, it was them." His voice cracked and he lifted his face, tears spilling down his cheeks. "They're everywhere, Daddy. I don't like them anymore." "Who, Cade? Who is everywhere?" Cade was practically choking on his sobs now. "The audience. They told me that you don't like me anymore because Mommy died. They told me Mommy got sick and lost all her hair and now she's in the ground." My chest seized up. "Cade, who told you that?" I had never told him his mother had gotten cancer. I rarely ever speak of her passing, for that matter. My wife and I had purposely sheltered him from the very end of her life, only allowing the happy memories to seep through the cracks of his memory. "They did. They told me to open all the curtains so they could get you, Daddy." As much as I hate to admit it, at that moment I was terrified. I felt my heart rate spike as I watched my son, dripping in saliva and salty tears, imagining phantom arms reaching through the windowsills and dragging us into a never-ending nothingness. "Sweetheart," I take a deep breath, attempting to steady my voice, "there's no such thing as the audience. They're imaginary. They're not going to get either of us. You're safe and sound here with me." I pulled him into a hug, squeezing him tightly as if to show this audience they were not taking away my Cade. "They're real," I heard him whisper, his head buried in my shoulder. That night I lay with him in bed until he fell asleep. I was careful not to wake him as I kissed his rosy, tear-streaked cheeks good night, ensuring he was finally out. I felt at peace knowing he was tucked in bed, safe. I made my way downstairs to tidy up the kitchen, cleaning the pile of stray dishes left from dinner. I went over to the sink and began scrubbing. I had only gotten through maybe 3 or 4 when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I froze instinctively, fixating on the pan in the sink, mid-scrub. There was something in the window, something my intuition was screaming at me not to look at. It was peeking at me, rising slowly into my peripheral vision. I felt the hairs on my arms rise, a chill running through me. Something was right in front of me, standing in front of the window. I couldn't bring myself to look. If I'm being completely honest, I was scared shitless. I could feel it staring at me, its eyes burning into the top of my head. I was afraid that if I acknowledged it, it would truly and entirely exist. In my motionless trance, I felt them begin to appear. They were all around me, their presences one by one being made known in front of every window of the house. This was their debut. I could feel each one in my bones, peering at first, then slowly rising in front of each open window in our home until they had reached their full length. Then they were all around me, staring at me through a thin sheet of glass. It was only a matter of time. I couldn't move, aside from my shaking hands still clutching that bubble-soaked pan in the kitchen sink. All I could think about was my son. Cade was still upstairs. I couldn't abandon him. These things had been tormenting him for weeks, and now was my chance to put a stop to it, to protect him. I knew I had only one option at this point. I sprang into action, launching myself from the kitchen sink and racing to my son's room. I saw them in the windows. They didn't move, didn't even flinch as I bounded up the stairs. They were colorless blurs as I ran past them, realizing then, and only then, that my house had far too many windows. I could make out some of their features, and honestly I wish I hadn't. Their eyes bulged unnaturally, so wide you could see the whites of them from top to bottom. And their mouths gaped open like the scream painting, far too wide for any human caliber, as if they had unhinged their jaws. Their skin was moist and pale and hairless, with swollen heads and skinny necks, bone-thin bodies gawking at me with that fixed expression, as if they were enthralled, captivated by the show. But there were no screams, none except for my own, of course. No sounds besides the thumping of my heart as it hammered into my chest. I nearly tore Cade's door off of his hinges, finding him sleeping peacefully in bed. That's where we've been for the past few hours, hiding under his covers, waiting for this nightmare to end, if it ever does. All I know is this: if your kid ever tells you they're talking to the audience, run.